Our chair for the panel is Professor Gopal Guru. He needs no introduction, but I'll do the honors. Professor Guru is an Indian political scientist. He's the editor of the journal Economic and Political Weekly. He is a retired professor in political science at Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was a visiting professor at Columbia University, Oxford, and University of Pennsylvania. Earlier, he taught at the University of Delhi and University of Pune. Professor Guru is the author of numerous articles on Dalit discourse, women, politics, and philosophy. His specialization includes Indian political thought, humiliation, social movements, etc. Our discussant for the panel is Dr. Priyanka Jha. Dr. Jha teaches at the Department of Political Science at the Banaras Hindu University. Her research interests lie in the domain of intellectual history of ideas, political thought in India and South Asia. Presently, she is also associated with the largest Pair Out project on intellectual history of global inequality, whereby she maps Indian thinking on inequality circa 1930s, 1970s at Aarhus University, Denmark. Her work on women thinkers in modern India is identified as New Voices on Women in History and Philosophy, University of Paderborn, Germany. Soon she'll be in Cambridge University for a semester in 2021 as the DC Pawate Fellow for her research on gender in global intellectual history, engaging with women thinkers and their ideas of normativities. She's currently working on a book manuscript, Thinking and Ideas in Modern India. We have four speakers for this panel, as for every other panel, and the panel is named Intellectual Histories from the Margins and Their Impact on the Indian Political. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you, Rohit. Am I audible? There might be some voice lag because of really bad network connection here in Banaras, but I will try my best that I'm able to communicate. So we have four very interesting papers in this session. And the first, so we would go by presentations first, which would be followed by discussion for around 20-25 minutes, in which I would be sharing my comments and my thoughts on these papers, and then the floor would be open for question and answers. So you, at your 18th minute, I would be sending you a private message as a reminder that you have 2 minutes left, so that we are on time. We have 20 minutes for each presentation. So on that note, we have the first presentation by Kelvin. So Kelvin, you have the one. I'm sorry, I don't have, because I was expecting Professor Guru to be introducing all of you. So
Priyanka,
Rohit,
I can introduce all. Yes, I'll introduce all of them. That's fine. Yeah, because Professor Guru was supposed to introduce, but I will introduce him until he's here, so that's fine.
That's wonderful. So on that note, let's just kickstart this very exciting conversation on rethinking Indian political history of ideas, and try to shift beyond the given in terms of the canons, in terms of the larger meta narrative which seems to be constructed on what is Indian thinking. So on that note, I would request Rohit to kindly introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Kelvin is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Yale University. He works on the intellectual history and labor history in the Indian Ocean, focusing on interactions between South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. His research interests include Marxism and its global itineraries, histories of the left, modern political thought, and post-colonial theory. His paper is titled The Labor of Self-Respect, Political Equality and Subaltern Internationalisms. So Kelvin, this was the role of the chair, but you have 20 minutes, so please try to stick to that. The discussant is in charge of moderating your time slot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohit, for that introduction. And before I start, I also just want to thank Professor Shah and Professor Guru, who's not here, but thank you for serving as the chair and the discussant for this panel. I'm just going to share some slides, if that's okay. Sorry. Do you all see my slides?
No.
All right. Sorry, just give me 1 second. it says I have to restart the meeting to share my slides. So regardless, I'll just read from the.
No, if you cannot,
the
Kelvin, if I may interject once. Kelvin, if I may interject once, if you cannot share your slides, you can use the screen share option. There's a button at the bottom screen. So if you play the slide on your computer, you can share it for us as well. If that works, there is also a slide share option, but there is also a screen share option at the bottom. I understand this is a new interface. Just look for the screen share option.
It's just that when I click it, it says I have to restart GoToMeeting to in order to be able to share my slides. So I'm just going to leave and come back really quickly. Apologies about that.
Oh, Rohit, by the way, not that it matters, but I thought I was meant to speak first.
Yeah, I think that's the schedule I sent, but it was to Professor Gopal Guru. So, do you mind speaking after Kelvin?
Oh, not at all, not at all.
Yeah, so I think the schedule that we had sent, because the discussant, Dr. Jha, was not supposed to be in charge of the structure. She was supposed to take care of the time, but because Gopal Guru is not here, the structure is, she has invited Kelvin first. So I noticed that as well, but she was not in charge of the structure. So you can go on.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Could I please ask something? Could you please tell me the sequence of the speakers now, given the changes?
Yeah, so it will be, so it was initially supposed to be Professor Dr. Sen, Dr. Dwaipayan Sen from Flame University, followed by Kelvin from Yale, Mukund from Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and Salwa. The only change now is Kelvin has spoken first. Will be presenting first. It will be followed by Dr. Sen. Then it would be Mukund from CSSC Calcutta, followed by Salwa from Freie Universität Berlin. Is that fine?
All right. Can you all see my slides now?
Yes.
All right. My apologies about that. So I'm just going to start now. The principal streets of Welt Key in Georgetown, leading up to the Victoria Jetty of the port of Penang, surged with a throng of thousands on the morning of December 20th, 1929. Mostly South Indian, the crowd eagerly anticipated the arrival of one Mr. Naika, known elsewhere perhaps more famously as Periyar E.V. Ramasamy. A renowned social reformer in the Madras presidency, he had recently just broken away from the Congress Party of Tamil Nadu 4 years earlier, instead founding the self-respect movement to promote a political program of radical anti-casteism, gender equality, iconoclastic atheism, and Dravidian revivalism. While the majority of onlookers at the jetty warmly greeted Periyar's arrival with unprecedented interest, quote, notably including Penang's Tamil Muslim community, a significant contingent of Penang's Orthodox Hindus had opposed his tour of Malaya. The Penang Hindu Sabha petitioned to the resident councillor and the chief police officer of Penang to forbid his visit, while disconcerted Brahmin journalists and editors exhorted readers to boycott Periyar's speeches and the atheistic self-respect movement. In the decade subsequent to this landmark visit, the Tamil press of British Malaya would come to extensively debate the political consequences, symbolic import, ethical relevance, and locally specific applicability of Periyar's self-respect movement to the quotidian experiences and lived geographies of the Tamil diaspora in the cities and plantations of the Malay Peninsula. The vibrancy of these debates testified to the emergence and development of a new consciousness of the Tamil diaspora in Malaya, forged in and through the interactions between various political, intellectual, and cultural currents within a wider oceanic knowledge economy. Whereas the extant historiography of Tamil cultural and intellectual life in British Malaya, or present-day Malaysia and Singapore, has predominantly been narrated as a history of diasporic formation, articulated within the grammar of cultural memory, minority politics, and a reified ethnic notion of transnationalism, the historiography of Tamil political, social, and cultural movements in South India has conversely emphasized its regional distinctiveness, autochthonous development, and localized contours of the growth of Tamil associational politics and Dravidian ideology. By placing these political and social developments within a frame of spatial and temporal coevalness, however, within and against the wider historical geographical field of their emergence, this paper argues that an intellectual history of Tamil vernacular consciousness in 19th and 20th century British Malaya must be apprehended within the political and social cultural context of transoceanic exchanges, which structure the epistemological conditions for its thinkability and plausibility responsibility among an emergent generation of reformers. It draws on a range of Tamil language newspapers published in British Malaya and the Madras Presidency in the interwar decades between 1919 and 1939, including Tamil Nesan, Munitram, and Tamil Murasu from Singapore and Malaya, and Kudi Arasu from the Madras Presidency. It derives methodological sustenance from Reinhard Koselleck's idea of conceptual history, which provides a methodological approach to source criticism in relation to the socio-historical life of concepts. If concrete histories, as Koselleck maintains, are always produced, quote, within the medium of particular experiences and particular expectations, the study attempts to explore the contingent and conjunctural conceptions of the historically possible as encoded within the critical intellectual traditions of Dravidian self-respect, Tamil vernacularism, and anti-caste radicalism. It ultimately argues that they ultimately index collective aspirations and imaginary futures beyond the frames of empire, diaspora, minority, or nation. So this paper makes three primary claims. First being that equality was the central problematic of the political for many of these Tamil thinkers in the diaspora. Second being labor as a grounds for the principle of reciprocal equality in social relations. In the half century between the 1880s and the 1930s, as several million Tamil migrants moved back and forth the Bay of Bengal, so too did a range of novel political subjectivities, closely attending to the development of local, diasporic, and transnational communities in these spaces. So with the opening of the west coast of Malaya to European capital, you see greater numbers of Tamil laborers arriving from the coastal districts of southeastern India, as well as the hinterland around Thanjavur and Tirunelveli, from a variety of backgrounds, including but not limited to lower caste Hindu or untouchable Dalit communities. The social world of these plantation towns in Malaya formed the staple of colonial documentation and Indian journalism alike, were noted for their strikingly harsh conditions of labor, where workers were faced with poor sanitary facilities and environmental conditions, discipline under a notoriously punitive labor code, and remained under the surveillance of and supervision of plantation foremen known as Kangani. On the other hand, though, the spread of cheaper print technologies around the Indian Ocean from 1950 onward enabled an increasing vernacularization of written expression in British Malaya, and the Tamil language press in Singapore, Penang, and Kuala Lumpur by the early 20th century became a site of contestation and debate over the identity and boundaries of the Tamil diasporic community in Southeast Asia. The successive waves of petitions, protests, and strikes throughout the 1920s and 30s gave shape to the ideological contours of an emergent conception of Tamil as an important category of political subjectivity, as exemplified by a petition in 1930 by 3 railway workers from Selangor to the Reverend C.F. Andrews lamenting the status of the Indian Tamils as, quote, nothing but a nation of coolies, and folding within itself the manifold religious...
Sorry for interrupting you, Kelvin. We can't see the slides.
Oh, you can't see the slide?
There's just one. No, we can't.
Oh yeah, I haven't changed
Apologies.
the slide. No worries. I haven't changed the slides. It's staying on this slide for now.
Oh, okay. It's just
Yeah.
white screen, Kelvin. Okay.
Oh wait, can you see it now?
No.
So. Oh.
No, we can't.
We could see it earlier. We lost the feed since then. Have you done something? We could see it earlier.
No, I haven't I haven't changed the slide at all.
Yeah, fine. That's fine.
Now we can see it.
All right. So by 1930, the Tamil public sphere in Malaya had came to be dominated by 2 differing schools of thought, represented by the Tamil Nesan on one hand, and the Munitram and the Tamil Murasu on the other. So strongly influenced by the politics of Indian nationalism, the Tamil Nesan was founded in 1924 and edited by Narasimha Iyengar, espousing a consistently pro-Congress and pro-Gandhian stand, and perpetuating a sort of religious orthodoxy or conservatism. Its primary ideological contender, the Munitram and the Tamil Murasu, were both established by G. Sarangapani as a putative challenge against the Brahmin dominance of the Tamil public sphere, and aligned with the Dravidian politics advanced by Periyar and his self-respect movement in Madras, focusing on caste and social reform. Despite their divergent political horizons, however, these newspapers shared a common concern with the status of the Tamil community, expressed the necessity of social and economic transformations through the paradigmatic category of labor. The availability, plausibility, and purchase of labor as a modality of claims making here is tied to historically specific contours and stakes. If the impulse of modern capital is to assume direct control over production processes, according a privileged status to the productive capacities of labor, then the fundamental role that labor assumes as a social relation under these conditions generates specific political, economic, and intellectual projects. So viewed in this light, the critiques and claims made by the Munetram and the Tamil Murasu are bound to the ongoing production of colonial unevenness, illumined and recognized through its most visible and material embodiment as plantation labor. So writing in the Tamil Nation, in observation of the rising tide of Indian, Burmese, Ceylonese, and Malayan nationalisms, Iyengar posed that, quote, there exist alien races that have amassed wealth and other rights through hard work, and that it is unfair and unjustified to expel these people from the country out of a circumstantial nationalistic fervor. In the subsequent year, the Tamil Nation repudiated the claims of the Malay nationalist newspaper Majlis by indicting, quote, village Malays living in comfort of inherited property, in contrast to the work of South Indian and Chinese migrants who had, quote, struggled to clear the forests, attacked by tigers, and bitten by mosquitoes in the economic development of British Malaya. Both the Munetram and Tamil Murasu, importantly, incisively criticized several aspects of plantation labor within their critique of caste, including depressed wages, long working hours, lack of proper estate facilities, the arbitrary force of the Gangani, and the indifference of educated Indian inspectors. If the central insight of Marx's mature critique of the tradition of classical political economy was that capitalism, as a historically specific abstract form of social mediation, is ultimately effected and mediated by labor, wherein living labor remains integral not simply to the production of society as a whole, but to the relations of objective interdependence among individuals, then the political critiques in the name of labor advanced by both newspapers represent attempts to stake claims on a set of legal and economic rights by appealing to the productive powers of labor, while simultaneously indicating the antinomy between practices of homogenization, which is the incorporation of Tamil laborers as a mobile labor force into the universalized social relations entailed in commodified wage labor, and differentiation, which is the active particularization of labor, not just by race or caste, but also by lineage and region of origin. So many of these newspapers had been intimately concerned with the local worlds of the Malay Peninsula, persistently highlighting the growing inequality between the towns and the plantations, between the urban elite and the agrarian laborers. Editorials on the responsibilities of a Tamil person in Malaya remain a mainstay among this newspaper, which vigorously asserted the need for vernacular education for lower caste Tamils in Malaya as a precondition for producing modern, respectable, and dignified Tamil subjects in Malaya. So just as Indian journalists in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta had become increasingly preoccupied with the question of Indian labor overseas, so too did the Tamil press in Penang and Singapore attempt to draw conceptual connections between the condition of Tamil plantation workers in Malaya with that of Indians in South Africa, Fiji, Ceylon, and Burma. The denial of political rights to Indians in South Africa, which had in the preceding 2 decades informed Gandhi's political energies as a young barrister in Durban, received prominent coverage and comments in the Tamil Nation, as the loot and murder faced by Indians in Burma amid the large-scale anti-Hindu urban riots in Rangoon and Mandalay, as well as the associational organizations and community life among Indians in Fiji. So these social spaces, material and imagined, colonial and national, political and cultural, the Tamil press imagined themselves to be inhabiting, in other words, cannot be figured as one of territorial nativism within the internal space of the nation, nor as ethnic transnationalism emerging from self-evident geographies, but rather the formation of Tamil diasporic subjectivity as a historically specific process of concept formation and intellectual reorientation was situated within these specific political and economic processes within with global and regional coordinates. So moving on to my next section, internationalizing Periyar. On December 15, 1929, E.V. Ramasamy Periyar set sail for Penang from Madras Presidency. His program of social reform needs no introduction. It placed stress on the idea of self-respect as a radical political alternative to the binary of colonial dependence and national independence, the former imposing economic exploitation from without, and the latter engendering social subjugation from within. Beginning in 1925 as well, Periyar and the nascent self-respect movement began publishing the weekly Kudi Arasu, which became the main vehicle for outlining the social and political program of this new ideology. So under the banner of no God, no religion, no Gandhi, no Congress, and no Brahmins, the self-respect movement advanced a detailed set of political demands for the betterment of Shudras, Ati-Dravidas, and women, including the condemnation of notions of superiority and inferiority, endemic to the caste hierarchy, the elimination of untouchability and the right of access to temples and wells for all communities, the channeling of temple funds for secular uses, the abolition of caste suffixes in personal names, the prescription of holy texts promulgating Brahmanism, the uplift of women and the conduct of self-respect marriages, and the extension of rationalism and equality to all aspects of South Indian society. So here, it's worth noting that Periyar's own political philosophy was deeply informed by a transnational field and historical conjuncture. Earlier on, he had argued that the phenomenon of Tamil labor migration abroad was born of the strictures of caste oppression, which Gandhian nationalism had failed to eliminate. And subsequently, upon his visit to Europe and the Soviet Union in 1932, he had corresponded with Indian immigrant Marxists, including Abani Mukherjee, C.P. Dutt, and others, and published the first Tamil translation of the Communist Manifesto in the Kudi Arasu over 1931. But the rhetorical power and ideological purchase of the self-respect movement in British Malaya was tied to the practical conditions governing the social life of the Tamil diaspora there, rendering its radical political critique of Brahminical hegemony, socio-economic deprivation, and religious superstition a matter of urgent necessity. The institutional infrastructure of the colonial plantation economy amplified the impact of stigmatization and exclusion, as barriers of purity and pollution were strictly enforced on the estates, reproduced through the segregation of the state schools, the architecture of workers' housing, the social organization of ritual festivals, and the maintenance of hierarchical relations between Dalits and those of higher castes. The structural position of abjection experienced by Tamil Dalits in Malaya in the metaphor of Nilakanda Iyer of the Central Indian Association of Malaya was such that the only prospect he sees after he has given the labor of a lifetime is to die in the estate labor lines. Malaya too has no use for this sucked oranges. Throughout the 1920s, urban Tamil writers and activists, mostly affiliated with G. Sarangapani, endeavored to establish regular correspondences and connections with the self-respect movement. And Periyar's visit coincided with the emergence of self-respect principles in Malayan Indian associational life throughout the 1930s. A self-respect organization in Malaya was founded in the name of the Tamil Reform Association in 1932, which drew up to 600 members, including 40 overseas members by 1940. Headquartered in Singapore, but present in other cities in Peninsular Malaya, including Malacca and Penang, the Tamil Reform Association under G. Sarangapani's leadership demanded a political and religious resolution to the twin problems of Dalit subjugation and Dravidian debasement, rendering the abolition of untouchability central to its political program. Indeed, so intertwined with these two ideological forces that the overwhelming attitude of Malaya's, quote, North Indians and Ceylon Tamils toward Tamil Dalit progress, as one O. Ramasamy Nadar argued at a meeting for the association, was one of derision and disparagement. Quote, the Tamilian, the Kuli, what can they do? Other than establishing a library where Kudi Arasu and other self-respect publications were made available, the association also came to be affiliated with the Tamil Marasu, reprinting news reports, speeches, opinion editorials, and advertisements promoting the self-respect movement and its program of social reform. The politics of antagonism towards Brahmanism, Aryanism, and Hinduism assume a newfound tenor among the self-respecters in Malaya. So a speaker at an association meeting in 1936 Singapore condemned the political quietude that was installed in Tamils by Aryan Brahmin, quote, Puranic nonsense. Another speaking at the 1930 Taiping Adi Dravidian Mahaja Association meeting reaffirmed the Malayan movement's commitment to Periyar's self-respect movement in India, pronouncing that it was, quote, because the movement had endeavored to destroy the vile institution of caste in our Indian nation, that we are forming like-minded associations there as well as here in this Malayan nation. Indeed, Sarangapani's founding of the Tamil Marasu, as outlined in its first issue on July 6, 1935, was with the object of eliminating anything and anyone standing in the path of Tamil's progress. This stated aim, as Sarangapani later elaborated, was, quote, to remove Brahmin influences in politics, society, and journalism. So echoing Periya's attempts to re-signify caste subjugation from the social space of political antagonism onto the plane of mytho-historical time, various Malayan Tamil journalists endeavored to reframe their caste struggles within the frame of a structural Aryan-Dravidian antagonism. Addressing the decline and debasement of Tamil civilization, an editorial in the Tamil Murasa proposed that the recent entry of Aryans into India had endangered our civilization. This ascendance of an Aryan Brahminical order could fuse caste into religion and termed as Tamils who were once the paragon of civilization, sons of courtesans and a prostituted people through which they enslaved us. Similarly, the founder of the Tamils Reform organization opined that like a fox that had been intoxicated by honey, the Tamil people had fallen to the scheming Brahmins and had therefore lost their common sense. Yet other editorials attempted to map the politics of caste distinction onto the semantics of linguistic practice. Corresponding with the anti-Hindi movement in the Madras presidency, many Tamil reformers had insisted on the necessity of Tamil linguistic revivalism in Malaya. So undergirding this growing body of writing was the use of Aryan Dravidian antagonism as a concept metaphor for caste, as a conflictual and antagonistic social structure suffused by violence. Indeed, following Anupama Rao's important argument that fully and unambiguous reflexive appropriation of history provided a potential mode of political redemption, these attempts at anchoring Tamil Dalit suffering to the deep structure of Hindu mytho-historical time, now elaborated as a genealogy of Aryan Brahminical hegemony, came to become the authorizing explanation of marginal identity and the embodied experience of subalternity and violence. So understanding both the religious and political is formally differentiated, but yet systematically interdependent and mutually constitutive. These writings in the Tamil Murasa frame religions as immanent rather than extraneous to the political field, such that any project of political emancipation necessitated antagonism to religious identification rather than a transcendence of religious identity. So questioning the terms of religious and political inclusion, the Tamil Murasa argued that the horizon of emancipation was not to be contained within existing social relations, but rather necessitated a transformation of Tamil Dalit identity both as a non-Hindu minority and as an inaugural Dravidian political subject. So these early 20th century attempts by Tamil self-respecters across both sides of the Bay of Bengal to deal with the structural transformations in their intellectual and political fields has a particular productivity for the project of political critique, attesting to the expressive negotiations, transpositions, and forms of social agency that challenge apparently immutable structures of domination. So rather than figuring this intellectual relationship between Madras and Malaya as one emerging outward from pre-given social relations spaces, the shifting valence that these thinkers accorded to their horizons of expectation attests to the reciprocal determination between contradictory structures and forms of agency, political economy, and cultural nationality. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelvin. This is a really nice paper. So we'll move as per schedule, and we'll move to Dr. Sen. So I will introduce Dr. Sen, and then we have three other papers. Dr. Dwaipayan Sen is Associate Professor of History at Flame University. He received his PhD in History and MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago. He holds a BA in History and English from Oberlin College. His research and teaching interests cover a broad spectrum and include British colonial rule in South Asia, the history of Indian nationalism, the politics of caste, subaltern studies, and the partition of British India. He is the author of The Decline of the Caste Question, Jogendranath Mondal and the Defeat of Dalit Politics in Bengal. This came out from Cambridge University Press in 2018. He has articles in journals like Modern Asian Studies, the Indian Economic and Social History Review, History Compass, and Economic and Weekly. He has also contributed essays to like The Wire, India Seminar, and Himal. His current book project is provisionally titled Rethinking the Colonial Census, Indigenous Agency and the Work of Enumeration. The study aims to reevaluate extant interpretations of the census as a tool of colonial domination and seeks to demonstrate the extensive role played by various indigenous and subaltern actors in the implementation and consequences of this administrative mechanism. His paper is titled To Seek a Nobler Inheritance, the Namasudra-Baptist Exchange of Early 20th Century Bengal. Over to you, Dr. Sen.
Great. So thank you very much, Rohit. Am I audible, by the way?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Rohit, for organizing this wonderful workshop and bringing us all together. And thank you to those of you in the audience for being here today. It's 5 a.m. where I am, so please bear with me if I'm a little sleepy. My remarks today are largely drawn from the introduction and conclusion of the draft that I circulated, but they should offer, I think, a fairly decent idea of where I'm going in this paper. So here goes. Uncanny correspondences between Dalit actors and the liberal dispositions professed by their Baptist counterparts can be observed by considering the history of Namashudra activism over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While the presence of missionaries amidst Dalits in colonial Bengal has readily been noted, it's clear that the traditional dating of 1872 as some kind of originary moment may be reconsidered in light of the history of their interactions with the Baptists. As significantly, the extent and nature of their contact remains under-examined and quite literally limited to a mere handful of pages in the conventional nationalist account of the Namashudra movement in Bengal. On the contrary, Bengali Dalits engaged European interlocutors from considerably prior to 1872 and appear to have held them in great esteem, particularly when it came to articulating their own social and political aspirations. Subaltern consciousness in this instance was in no way opposed to foreign influences and interlocution, which appeared to have been heartily welcomed rather than shunned. Evidently, Dalits in eastern India entertained the outreach of various European missionaries from at least the 17th century onwards, but it was with the Baptist Mission Society of the early 19th that any meaningful exchange first emerged. By 1838, their missionaries found a reception with one Kangali Mohanto, a contemporary spiritual leader of the Namashudras in Borishal, who agreed to be baptized along with 115 of his disciples to the Christian faith. The trend evidently progressed despite, quote, persecution from Orthodox Hindus. Indeed, a report that noted how nearly 400 adults had been baptized and the nominal Christian community numbered around 4,000 souls in Borisha, which was an area of Namashudra preponderance between the years 1852 and 61, also observed as follows, quote, they have suffered greatly from persecution. It is with no satisfaction that their Hindu landlords have seen the people of 50 villages breaking from the thraldom of centuries and refusing to pay all the illegal cesses to which idolatrous festivals and observances have given rise. At times, therefore, strong attempts have been made to intimidate them by the violence to which such enemies resort. Beatings, confinements, money fines have been frequent. End quote. A mid-19th century Baptist Reverend J.C. Page thus noted that while the Charals, or as Namashudras were then known in customarily derogatory address, were despised by the Brahmin and oppressed by the Zemindar, some amongst them were at the same time gaining possessions, aspiring to knowledge, and rising to a kind of respectability. Such aspirations towards social mobility and dignified selfhood very likely contributed to the first recorded mass agitation by the Namashudras in 1872 that resolved not to serve any amongst the upper classes and castes unless a better position among the Hindu castes than what they at present occupy was given to them. Clearly, then, several decades, if not longer, of Namashudra consideration of the Christian faith preceded their supposed late 19th century origins as a movement and informed their aspirations for social mobility. When Gurucharan Babu, Guruchad Thakur, patriarch of the influential Namashudra Motua sect, requested the famed Baptist doctor and Reverend C.S. Mead for a large print Bengali Bible in the early 1900s, the gesture came as an important development in a fairly extended period of exchange and intelligibility between the two parties. So, how do we make sense of this history of Namashudra and Baptist engagements in a way that reduces none of the actors involved to the caricatures or dupes to which we have become accustomed? While Rupa Vishwanath's recent skepticism as regards the intention of Protestant missionaries in Tamil country is a salutary reminder of the need for reading their sources with extra care and caution, the problem of motive is all the more muddled with Bengal, for unlike the South, missionary efforts did not result in appreciable number of converts, despite a matching intensity of zeal. What did the Namashudras make of these figures? What did they see in them? Even as Shumit Sharka's observation that Namashudra motivations were entirely pragmatic informs the analysis pursued here, the phrase nonetheless seems to undermine the actual care, deliberation, and consideration Namashudras appear to have extended their missionary correspondence over the course of their engagements. Surely more than mere pragmatism informed this relationship. Allow me to illustrate the burden of these questions with the following example. Apparently, it was in fact a deputation amongst them that first initiated contact with residents of the Baptist Mission House in Faridpur. In Mead's rendition, they asked, quote, "We come as representatives of a great sad class, hated, despised, downtrodden, treated like dogs for centuries. We have at last waked to the fact that we too are men, that the same great God who made the proud Brahmin made us too, and we have it in our hearts to rise to a better and a bigger life. Will you help us?" End quote. Mead replied with the word of Christ, to which they responded that they were certainly deliberating on the matter, yet no clear resolution had arrived amongst them as yet. Quote, we do not know what to do, only this we know, we are determined somehow to rise to a better life, to seek a nobler inheritance. Note the indecision about conversion to Christianity, coupled with the singular focus on securing a better life, to seek a nobler inheritance, for the uncertainty offers clues as to what was at stake in their outreach. Based on the analysis of Australian Baptist missionary documents that have not been consulted as yet, this paper argues that the early 20th century history of interactions between Namashudra and Baptist missionaries contributed to the deepening of a variety of what historians have termed vernacular liberalism. By this I mean that the dynamics that evolved between them assisted in sharpening the Namashudra critique of caste inequality and in clarifying the kinds of freedoms and liberties they sought. I attempt to demonstrate that despite the misgivings they harbored about wholesale conversion to Christianity, they nonetheless perceived great value, both ideational and material, in their exchanges with their Baptist interlocutors that were premised on deeply liberal assumptions about their rightful place in Bengali society. The social and political aspirations to which Namashudras would turn over subsequent decades were born of their contact, and thus constitute an important instance of affinities between subaltern and European actors that contribute long rehearsed assumptions about their antinomy. In summary, then, here are the set of related concerns my presentation of the materials in this paper helped me address. For some time now, historians of colonial India have become accustomed to regarding European engagements with South Asia with suspicion on account of the generally demeaning, negative, and misleading representations of Indian society and culture in these traditions. A corollary gesture has been to locate an authenticity within the allegedly untrammeled and autonomous domain of subaltern consciousness. This state of affairs is also starting to change as a growing body of argument and evidence accumulates that confounds such binary distinctions, particularly with respect to the history and historiography of Dalit past that suggest, as in the analysis I've pursued, complex entanglements between Dalit actors, missionaries, and the colonial state. In the instance illustrated here, the history of Namshudra and Baptist exchange certainly jumbles the usual historiographical distinctions between subaltern subjectivity and its European other, even as challenging questions about intentionality and interpretation from the vantage of either set of actors deserve close deliberation and debate. In addition, I certainly don't wish to imply in any straightforward and unproblematic fashion that Namashudras successfully imbibed liberalism from their Baptist interlocutors, even though this is a possibility that perhaps ought not to be jettisoned in entirety. A more plausible claim would underscore its dialogical formation, born of the practical activities they jointly undertook. Nor am I suggesting that the Baptists ushered Namashudras into the modern, but I am asking about the role of unintended consequences of their conjunction. For it does seem to me to be the case that, unbeknownst to the proselytizing will, Namashudras strategically extracted whatever they found valuable from the thought and practices of the Baptists in their search for a bigger and better life, and that at the risk of overstating the matter, they utilized the Baptists, as much as vice versa, in their quest for a nobler inheritance amidst a world that offered little by way of fraternity and or egalitarianism. In this respect, the Namashudras proved to be subaltern collaborators par excellence. As the late C.A. Bailey argued, quote, if there was any distinct subaltern ideological sphere, then this too was also heavily tinctured with liberal ideas of rights and justice by the end of the colonial period. Namashudras thus sincerely perceived in the Baptists an indispensable means to their justified ends of securing a better life for their community. They appropriated from them, and by extension, key figures in the colonial officialdom, those elements that would enable them to live a more desirable existence. Indeed, it was through these fairly sustained engagements that they became empowered to articulate their community's aspirations with greater confidence than before, and ultimately to express deeply liberal assumptions about their place in Bengali society and politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sen, for that wonderful paper and for joining us at this early an hour. You didn't seem drowsy at all, so thank you. Very illuminating paper. We'll move on to the other speaker now. We have our next speaker is Mukund Madhav has completed his MPhil from Center for Social Sciences, Calcutta, where his main research objective was to excavate vernacular archives documenting anti-caste Buddhist resistance in United Provinces in the 19th century. Mukund's research interest could be located at the intersection of intellectual and social history with a dedicated focus on micro and macro experiences within the anti-caste movements. He has also worked with an interest in documenting and preserving vernacular archives at institutional levels, such as part of the British Library Endangered Archives program, and personal capacities. He would like to continue to strive towards chancing a new archives and see what possibilities histories could they bring into light. The title of his paper is Refiguring a Vulgar History, Meanings of Anti-Caste Buddhist Resistance. Mukund, over to you.
Thank you, Rohit, for such a generous introduction and for conducting it. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, in case there is some internet connectivity issue, please do let me know if I go off at any moment. Thank you for the chair, to the chair for taking up this difficult job, I guess. And thank you for everyone in the audience being here in such difficult times. And I hope that everyone is doing well wherever they are. And I'll just read from the paper that I had circulated. So the title, as mentioned by Rohit, the title of my paper is Refiguring a Vulgar History, Meanings of Anti-Caste Buddhist Resistances. In the midnight of 29 September 2020, while the country was recovering from the turmoil of lockdown crisis, a pyre was lit a few hundred kilometers from national capital in Hathras district. The fire was consuming a body that had been site of caste-based oppression and subjugation. The fire was consuming a 19-year-old Dalit woman from Valmiki community who was gang raped by 4 upper caste men and murdered by casteist institutions. A demand of justice and equality had evaded her even in death, and yet the pyre was to become a moment to facilitate in achieving the boiling point for initiating a radical declaration. A declaration that was to put in place a new locus for potentially altering the lived experiences of other members of Valmiki community. This locus was to be patterned along the political project of conversion into Buddhism. In the next 15 days, conversions en masse were to take place across the state of Uttar Pradesh, with the largest taking place in Karera village, Ghaziabad district, where 300 individuals converted into Buddhism. The process was instituted by Ambedkarite Buddhist organization of the state and performed by Bauddha Sanghas attached to the Ambedkarite organization. Stepping into a new fraternity, the conversion ceremony entailed members of community for taking refuge under the three Ratna of Buddhism, Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, supplemented by their vows of not following rituals enshrined in Hindu scriptures. It was an exit from a collective constructed around the pseudo-norms of sacred and profane, realized through the purification processes such as fasting and sacrifices, and aim for a collective that extends solidarity in every act of transgressing barriers of caste-based sanctions and denials. Surely the act of conversion, even in recent past, does not carry an episodic character to it. We have seen such instances after Una and other such resistances. The resistance to caste-based violence forms an everydayness, similar to the act of perpetrating caste atrocities, formulating a resistive being in the Dalit ontology. Buddhism offers, in numerous Dalit accounts, a window to get out of the oppressive structures, realizing this resistive being. In process, configuring potentialities of experiencing equality and justice. The response of state to such acts of resistances was to expose the fault lines within the imagined secular fabric of society and governmentality. Within months, the Uttar Pradesh government was quick to enact the Unlawful Conversion Act 2020 in order to prevent any act of mass conversion with a political design at its undercurrent. The narrative above of caste atrocity, resistance to it, and failure of the state have pushed two vital questions. Logics of relating potentialities of equality and justice with conversion to Buddhism, and imagining a new secular contra to the failure of the present secular state. Introspection on both questions have received a treatment that overlaps to a great extent in various intellectual histories of anti-caste resistances. Unearthing the archives of anti-caste resistances, exercises in intellectual history have managed to construct a topology linking Buddhism with aspirations of freedom and equality that emerges from such resistances. From these very topologies, varieties of a new secular are placed into spotlight in historical reconstruction. The historical zenith of such imaginations in numerous accounts of anti-caste intellectual history arrives with the event of Bhimrao Ambedkar's conversion in 1956, and in his subsequent programmatic text, The Buddha and his Dhamma. For one to look into the phenomena of conversion in present times, it remains an immediate task to take cognizance of tools and concepts employed by the accounts of intellectual history while locating such a zenith in Ambedkar. It's crucial to seek the language of emancipation derived by such accounts of intellectual history from Ambedkar's life and text. This enables a scope for a parallel exercise of seeking similar or different languages located at the margins of current intellectual history of anti-caste resistances. At the core of such an exploration lies a deeply embedded ideological question as put out by Hayden White for the practices of intellectual history by proposing to read it closely for its meaning, its production, its distribution, and its consumption. To restate the ideological stance for our present task, one might put forth the question, in what ways have the dominant anti-caste intellectual histories impinged upon Ambedkar's idea to read acts of conversion to Buddhism? Further, such an ideological stance makes it imperative to question probabilities of deriving a different set of meaning and means of production from archival grains that have been kept aside by the present intellectual historical accounts. Premising itself on the idea of history writing as primarily a conversation between the historian and the archive, this paper seeks to initiate a dialogue about usage of conceptual despotive for implanting the historical imagination of anti-caste Buddhist resistances. It begins with introspecting on such a conversation between socio-political context of Ambedkar thoughts and practices in building an anti-caste Buddhist resistance and meanings provided to it in the accounts of intellectual history. Proceeding from it, the paper would look into potentialities of unearthing alternative meanings of anti-caste Buddhist resistances if the conversation was to shift grounds into non-canonical archival territories. A shift of such kind is proposed by taking cues from such resistances built in early 20th century United Provinces. In doing so, the paper comments upon how imaginations of anti-caste Buddhist resistances becomes a landscape of variegated thought and practice. An imagination being fueled by the vulgar syntax as opposed to the categories of modern mentalities. Finally, the paper would argue to attempt to establish grounds to argue for reading concepts central to anti-caste resistances, such as fraternity, on this undercurrent of variegated landscape. The Euler Declaration of Ambedkar, "I will not die a Hindu," marks a rupture in epistemic and political life of anti-caste resistances. The radical initiation for an exodus from the oppressive regime of Brahmanical fold by Ambedkar was to direct the endeavors of anti-caste movement in a new direction, which peaks in act of conversion in 1956. Both the declaration and reconstruction of anti-caste resistances have been embellished as a milestone in intellectual history of anti-caste struggles, cultivating a particular trope of understanding the logics behind conversion and the materiality to this transformation. Such proceedings have left a trail of contrasting phenomena, where on one hand it enriches a variegated comprehension of Ambedkar's canonical text, especially the Buddha and his Dhamma, while on the other effacing from those very canons traces of vernacular influences and ideologies. In light of such a persistent contradiction, the prospect of comprehending anti-caste political action have not remained untouched. In exploring such nuances within narratives of intellectual history, the paper dwells upon two erudite takes on Ambedkar's life and text, and looking into its repercussions for anti-caste Buddhist resistances. Soumyabrata Chaudhary's Ambedkar and Other Immortals, and Aishwarya Kumar's Radical Equality. At this point, it needs to be said that this exercise is not exhaustive in any manner. It could have gone all to Gail Omveld, Eleanor Zeliot, Anil Teltumbre, Christoph Jefferlot. But for the paucity, I am taking just these two examples. Also seeing the fact that of late these two takes have become part of the public discourse and have given us new tools to understand Ambedkar's life. Soumyabrata Chaudhary's work opens a new direction in making sense of Ambedkar's words, decisions, and political actions in their very interpretation through a methodological tool of historical immortality. To recast Ambedkar in such a manner allows allows one to assess and learn about his political program in the very here and now, bounded by its very contingencies, yet in the language of the universal. Reading the event and text of 1956 in this vein permits Chaudhary to assert for a foundation of a new letter of collective politics, aiming to institute a new self and collective for anti-caste resistances. At the core of this new self, Chaudhary places a fusion of ontology, Buddhist theology, and collective plans, the reasoning for which could be deciphered in looking out for an Ambedkarite Kantianism. By the very employment of an Ambedkarite Kantianism as the undercurrent of particular taste is imparted for reading Ambedkar's Act and Text of 1956. Chaudhary's thesis on the emergence of a subjective obligation mandated by the act of conversion is supplanted by Kantian subjective obligation, demarcating separation of religious and moral experience in Ambedkar's imagination of an anti-caste Buddhist resistance. The self and duty in this very configuration become liberated through an act of rationality. Kant's categorical imperative at the core of his religious imagination. It is at this juncture Chaudhary echoes closely with the proposal of Ambedkar regarding the correct outlook of this new self, informed by a Buddhist reading in conducting one's mentality on the principle of cause and effect. Premised on considering Buddha as an exemplary moral guide, the duty of this new self becomes to demarcate right from wrong in lieu with compass of possibility and impossibility derived from rationality. Through a denial of religious ontology in Ambedkar's schema of conversion by Chaudhary, the fact of distancing this new self from scriptural framework also comes to fore. Religion, or Dhamma as Ambedkar would employ it, is hence subtracted from tenets and practices of orthopraxy, establishing individual as the sole mover of its action and destiny. Ambedkar manages to achieve this in consonance with Chaudhary's analysis by refuting the importance of prayer and invocation for the divine in constructing his reading of Buddhism. Evoking the Kantian roots of Ambedkar's anti-caste Buddhist resistance, an exercise in intellectual history by Chaudhary facilitates one to dive into making some sense of this new emancipated self. Still, a section of Ambedkar's proposal remains outside comprehension if one was to premise on Kantian notion of reading religion related to possibilities of seeing Dhamma as a principle of governmentality, to map the public with the private.
Sorry for interrupting you. Mukund, you have 5 more minutes. Yeah, you're not reading. Yes.
Okay, right. This kind of conceptualization becomes best illustrated with Aishwarya Kumar's work, Paucity of Time. I'll leave it, but we can come to this later. I come to the other, so this kind of dialogue showcases how the Kantian schema or this particular way of reading Ambedkar and focusing on Ambedkar as the stroke. I come to this other side, which is a different side of towards a vulgar intellectual history. In pursuits of reframing the axis of performing exercises in intellectual history of anti-caste Buddhist resistances, an important turn comes from locating texts that find existence in space beyond dominant archival repositories and in epistemologies that continue to drive our readings of such resistances. An existence of such kind lies close to Paul Wien's reading of Vulgar History, for which we turn towards Buddhist resistances against caste structure in the United Provinces during early 20th century. The paragon of such resistances in United Province comes from life and text of Bhikkhu Bodhanand Mahaz, a Theravada Buddhist monk, which was lived out in traditional practices and thoughts of individuals participating in these resistances. Below, an attempt is made to lay threadbare how an intellectual history of Bodhanand's educated imagination of a new Buddhist ontology attaches meaning which escapes any closure from prevalent discursive practices of intellectual history. So, the indispensable key for this new being, as per Bodhanand's political project, was to derive meanings for thinking and acting from tropes implanted within traditional practices of Buddhism. To materialize this vocabulary of becoming, Bodhanand took an essential task of putting together the Bodhacharya Paditi, a text which was to find its life within the affective being of new converts into Buddhism. Encoding the genesis of this new self within the religious grammar of Buddhism, the position of Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha becomes primary for Bodhanand as ideal types for producing a new individual sensibility. The stakes of these three pillars become vital for ushering in a doctrine that molds this new self along lines of ritualistic behavior in concordance with these three pillars. The self was to imbibe ethics central in formulating an individual outside the frontiers of caste. So Bodhanand does this program along the two lines of the individual and the community. For the time being, I will focus on the community. The other important strand for cultivating community also made its way into concerns of Bodhanand. A cornerstone of such rumination lies in providing a new Buddhist semiotic by Bodhanand to popular Hindu festivals. A prime example of this stands a new constitution of Vijayadashmi as Ashoka Vijayadashmi. The festival of Vijayadashmi holds significance in Hindu festivities as it marks death of Ravana at the hand of Rama, an act allegorically to the victory of good over evil. As Bodhanand generates a new meaning of Vijayadashmi as a day which marks Ashoka giving up his violent path of conquering kingdom and took Buddhism as a part of connecting with different kingdoms. Bodhanand continues that on listening to news of Ashoka giving up arms, the common people were happy and wanted to mark it as a day that would be remembered for eternity. Therefore, the practice of celebrating Vijayadashmi began, and on this day, every person following the example of Ashoka should remember the doctrines of exemplar Buddha and give dana to bhikkhus. The individuals were supposed to come to the Buddha Vihara, sit, meditate on the notions of Buddha, the examples, the life of Buddha and the teachings of Buddha, and take the Sharanan of the Sangha and think about the community together along with each other. The Bodhacharya Paditi as a text demonstrates the vision of Bodhanand in encoding values of subject and community, which channels its ethical sustenance from embodying through customary and traditional practices, doctrine brought to light by Buddhism. In aspirations of fleshing out axioms for such embodiment, Bodhanand offers a viable alternative to existing caste-ridden structures and actively resists against Brahmanical doctrines and principles. Following up on this discussion, for the paucity of time, I've compressed it with just Shomubrata Chaudhary and Bodhanand's one thing. But two things come to fore. As we see in Chaudhary's analysis, the Kantian is one of the main ways of how you produce meaning to Ambedkar's text and to anti-caste Buddhist resistances. The second one, so two questions come to fore. The first one aligns with the ideological positioning of producing, attaching meaning, and consuming the intellectual histories, exploring structures of anti-caste Buddhist resistances. The second one demands response towards the logical proposition of political decision to be made in here and now. In posturing the conversation with thoughts and praxis of canonical texts, I'll just take 2 more minutes. Of canonical texts of anti-caste resistances, the intellectual history has produced a double helical structure at the center of our consumption. The structure forms around the central axis of a syntax that already prevalent modern ethos that permits a mapping of historian viewpoint on the archival sources, which can be seen in case of Ambedkar, Ayoti Thasar by readings of them. The structure spotlights through Ambedkar and other cases, meaning that remains in harmony with intellectual categories in a Eurocentric vein of the modern nation state. Acknowledging the importance of such interventions, the exercises of engaging with texts and practices that lie outside the double helical structure posits potentialities for initiating new conversations of looking at anti-caste Buddhist resistances. The interventions of Bodhanand in formulating such a political action initiates a conversation of such a calling for a new cartography of resistances that latches onto discovering meanings from the vulgate. It calls for locating scopes for emancipation ascribed in the practices of the popular, group meditation in the nearest Buddha Viharas, or reconstructing festivals such as Vijayadashmi. The contrast of these two tropes of performing intellectual history perhaps gives a call for repositioning the variegated landscape of intellectual history as a chronotope of vocabularies rooted in modern and vulgar. The demand for formulating new self and fraternities becomes an urgent task in light of incidents such as Hathras. Such incidences ask for the locus of emancipation once the threshold of tolerance is crossed over by the anti-caste resistances. Insights from Bodhanand's Padhati reinforce the location of piety in resistance to caste structures. The bonds of piety surface as essential glue binding the new fraternity of converts into Buddhism through a collective moral reform. The ritualistic assertion of this moral reform creates new scopes and spaces to strengthen the differences from Hindu practices sought by new fraternities. Emphasis on such adhesiveness of moral reform showcases in conviction of women of Valmiki community in gaining support of Buddhist communities in the time of distress when she says, "Kyunki wo apne hain." Thank you. Thank you for giving me some additional time to finish it. Can't hear you. You're muted.
Me?
Sorry, yeah. So, next speaker now. Thank you, Mukund. Salwa Yahya is a doctoral fellow in political science at the Berlin Graduate School, Muslim Cultures and Societies at Freie Universität Berlin. Salwa finished her bachelor's science honors from the St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, after which she completed her master's degree in political science from the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She then went on to earn an MPhil in social science from the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. Her overarching research interest lies in studying the modes of political and civic participation that Muslims in India adopt to exercise their political agency. The title of her paper is History from the Margins, a study of the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz. Salwa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rohit, for the introduction, and thank you to the chair and the discussant for taking up this responsibilities. Thank you very much. And as Rohit said, my paper is titled Intellectual History from the Margins, a study of the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz. And in my paper, I will try to present in a nutshell the establishment and evolution of a particular instance of lower caste politics as represented by the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz, henceforth AIPMM. The draft version of the paper has already been circulated, and in my presentation, I will flesh out certain points a little further. And I will also discuss the impact that the AIPMM has had on the political, especially the local political sphere of Bihar. So this paper is a part of my ongoing PhD project and is divided into three parts. The first part will introduce the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz and its goals and its objectives. The second part will try to trace the history of how the ideas of the lower caste and Dalit politics as represented by the AIPMM evolved in the 20th century. And lastly, the third part will discuss the minor gaps that have arisen between the political ideas of the AIPMM and its political actions. I will also briefly touch upon the impact that the AIPMM civic engagement has had on the political. So the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz, or in English, the All India Backward Muslim Front, is a loose coalition of lower caste Muslim groups which was established in 1998 in Patna, Bihar. The Persian word Pasmanda literally translates to those who have been left behind and signifies marginalized groups from within the Muslim community. In contemporary times, the Pasmanda movement in general refers to the various Dalit and lower caste organizations that have emerged from within the Muslim community, the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz or AIPMM being one of the most prominent among them. For example, in Maharashtra, the All India Muslim OBC organization of Shabbir Ansari, and in Bihar, Dr. Ijaz Ali's Backward Muslim Murja had already arisen in the 1990s. So as I was saying, the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz is one of the most prominent organizations within the larger Pasmanda Muslim movement, and it was a culmination of a pretty long historical trajectory. And there were other lower caste and Dalit Muslim organizations which had emerged from within the Muslim community, and the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz is one of the most prominent ones. So So it has had a pretty long history. And so in the years preceding its formation, its main founding members, Ali Anwar Ansari, a journalist or activist from Bihar, has studied and written about caste-based distinctions or discrimination within the Muslim community across vernacular newspapers in the state, Bihar. He, along with other Dalit and other backward Muslim activists, professionals, and intellectuals from within the Muslim community, founded the Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz in 1998 Bihar. It was an attempt to bring together various lower caste and Dalit Muslim groups from within the Muslim community of Bihar. It then spread to other parts of North India, such as Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh, after which the organization got christened as the All India Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz. My PhD project aims to analyze the civic engagement undertaken by the AIPMM, especially with regards to the claims or interventions it makes vis-à-vis the post-colonial state and civil society. Taking a cue from extant scholarship, I define civic engagement as a form of collective action aimed at securing certain public goals in either or both of the civil and political spheres. In my PhD project, which is ongoing, I specifically look at the way the AIPMM argues in favor of more appropriate affirmative action for Dalits and OBC Muslims and greater representation for them in official bodies. This apart, I also try to look at the way in which the AIPMM seeks to forge greater alliances between similarly placed caste groups across religious communities and civil societies, and how pre-existing Ambedkarite activism has impacted the AIPMM's articulations. I also look in my PhD project at how the AIPMM interacts and articulates their own critical claims vis-a-vis various other Muslim civil society organizations such as the All India Majlis-e-Mashawrat, the Milli Council, and religious organizations such as the Imarat-e-Sharia, and even political organizations such as the Indian Union Muslim League and the Overseas Party, the All India Muslim Ittihad al-Muslimin. So I look at how this organization, this particular forum consisting of low caste and Dalit Muslim groups, has articulated its positions vis-a-vis all these entities, the post-colonial state, civil society organizations, which comprise of Ambedkarite organizations and other Muslim civil society organizations. So what are the claims they make? What are the articulations they try to voice, and how do they make certain interventions within the larger within the larger civil society? I try to look at that in my ongoing PhD project. So in order to do so, I employ a qualitative research design which was both ethnographically informed and archival in nature. The specific data collection tools that I use for semi-structured or unstructured interviews and participation observation of protest events that the AIPMM was a part of. For the archival material, I collected pamphlets, AIPMM pamphlets, Pasmanda Awaz journal issues, and other writings from Ali Anwar Ansari's personal archives. And my ethnographic research was multi-local. I traveled across 3 Indian cities, Calcutta, New Delhi, and Patna, in order to gather data from regarding the AIPMM's activities, their interventions, and their articulations. So it was multi-local, and I employed both an ethnographically informed and archival approach in understanding the nature of civic engagement that the AIPMM engages in. And from the data gathered from the field, I pieced together the nature and history of the AIPMM's civic engagement. The ideas of the AIPMM's regarding religion and caste evolved in relation to the larger backdrop of political turmoil going on in the country at the late 20th century. It has also been argued that the emergence of the AIPMM and other such examples of lower caste groups in Bihar during that time was a result of the relatively better sense of security for Muslims in the state. Bihar had a relatively better track record of communal harmony, and the increased sense of safety that Muslims experienced in this region made them assertive about the material deprivation that they faced. So some historians have argued that the reason why so many lower caste groups, assertive lower caste groups from within the Muslim community emerged in Bihar was because Bihar already had a pretty good track record of communal harmony. Muslims felt physically secure within this region, so they became more assertive regarding the material deprivation they faced, and they were more vocal about certain aspects of claiming rights and affirmative actions from the post-colonial state. So, so some historians have argued that, and the implementation of the socially and educationally backward classes commission or the Mandal Commission recommendations in 1992 served as an important watershed moment for the crystallization of the Pasmanda movement's ideas on caste and religion, and more specifically those of the AIPMM. The AIPMM articulated its critical views on both of these meta concepts, that is caste and religion, and both of these meta concepts, as we know, have had a defining influence on the socio-political situation of the subcontinent. During my fieldwork, I noticed several interventions that the AIPMM made with regards to the way the state and civil society groups saw religion and caste-based distinctions in India. The AIPMM's critical ideas also came out very clearly in Ali Anwar Ansari's notable writings, such as Masawat Ki Jang, which translates to Struggle for Equality, which was published in 2003, and Dalit Musalman, which was published in 2005. Most of the ideas that Ansari puts forward in these works were gathered during his field study of the Muslim community in Bihar during the late 20th century. One of the most significant ideas that Ansari puts forward in his writings was that of a threefold division of the Muslim community. The Ashraf were the socio-religious elite of the Muslims who traced their lineage to foreign lands such as Arabia or Central Asia. It also referred to upper caste Hindu converts who had converted to Islam long time back when Islam first came in the subcontinent. The intermediate caste, the Ajlaf, were those caste groups which occupied the middle realm of the stratification, and at the lowest rungs, the Azal groups were considered the most inferior and were comparable to the Dalit groups of other communities. So the AIPM contended that the latter two groups, the Ajlaf and the Azal, could be considered the Pasmandas or backwards of the Muslim community. They were the bulk of the community and had converted to Islam when it came into the subcontinent many centuries ago. One of the chief arguments that the AIPMM makes with regards to caste is that the distinctions or differences based on it cross across religious groupings. In other words, caste-based stratification exists within the Muslim community, and there needs to be a greater recognition of this aspect. Therefore, in this case, appropriate caste-based affirmative action policies should be formulated by the state with regards to the lower caste groups within the Muslim community as well. More specifically, the AIPMM criticizes the Presidential Order of 1950, which debars Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims from getting the scheduled caste status. It claims that quite identical to the recognized scheduled caste groups of other religious communities, there exist similarly placed Dalit groups within the Muslim community as well. Through this, it questions the dominant understanding of the Muslim minority as a homogeneous group without any internal caste-based stratification. It is important to note that even though the Constitution of India mentions the term minority in Articles 29, 30, 350A and 350B, it does not define it in comprehensive terms. More significantly, the constitutional conception of a minority is based on linguistic, cultural, ethnic and religious parameters, with the central government having the power to designate a community as a minority. So the Constitution of India does not give a very comprehensive definition of the term minority, and it leaves the designation of any particular community as a minority to the central government largely. And the minority rights enshrined in the Indian Constitution are cultural and educational in nature, allowing minorities the right to preserve their distinctiveness or the difference. Scholars have noted that there was immense debate within the Constituent Assembly about the nature of minority rights that would exist in post-independence India. It has been noted that the final version of minority rights which was adopted did not see minorities as backward or in need of affirmative action policies. Rather, it was aimed at merely preserving their distinctiveness. Scholars have noted about how the notion of a minority in post-colonial India was largely that of difference, of cultural distinctiveness, and they could only expect the state to help them in maintaining that distinctiveness. But the dominant understanding of minority was not that of being backward or as being underdeveloped or in need of state affirmative action. So scholars have noted this and argued this, and and it is here where the AIPMM makes its most critical interventions. And in popular terms, of course, the idea of a minority is dominated by that of the Muslim community in post-colonial India. The AIPMM criticizes the above understanding of a minority and says that it does not take into account the material deprivation that majority of the Muslims, that is the Pasmanda Muslims, face in day-to-day life. In his writings, Ali Anwar Ansari says that the term minority causes a feeling of inferiority or insecurity among Muslims. This also comes out very clearly in the Pasmanda Awaz journals, which routinely criticize this whole understanding of a religious minority. And this Pasmanda Awaz journal was taken out by the AIPMM in the early 2000s, and it was in circulation in Bihar, in Patna specifically, where through which the Pasmanda Muslims in general voiced their opinion and their takes on various issues which concern the Muslim community as well as the larger civil society and also the state. So that is an interesting aspect of the interventions. And they say that the bulk of the Muslim community, the Pasmandas, are not a minority. When taken together with other similarly placed caste groups across religious communities, they actually form a majority in Indian society. Therefore, the AIPMM rejects the idea of a religious minority and seeks to establish alliances between caste groups, similarly placed caste groups, backward caste groups, Dalit groups across religious communities. The task of the AIPMM is to form horizontal solidarities with other lower caste and Dalit groups across communities. Another significant criticism that the AIPMM voices is that of the traditional social religious elite of the Muslim community. It says that the issues that have been raised by Muslim civil society organizations and even political organizations have largely been quote unquote emotional ones, such as that of the Muslim personal law or the Babri Masjid demolition. The AIPMM says that instead of raising these issues, it makes more sense to talk about social awareness and political participation of Muslims in India. So when I was conducting my fieldwork, two Hindi terms came out very prominently: Samajik Bedari and Satta Mein Hissedari, which is social awareness and political participation. So AIPMM says that there needs to be a greater talk about Samajik Bedari and Satta Mein Hissedari of Pasmanda Muslims. The AIPMM also criticizes how the Ashraf or the social religious elite have dominated almost all the Muslim civil society and political organizations. So some of my interlocutors also said that the state also sees the upper caste Muslims as the main leaders of the Muslim community and does not really take into account the opinions of the Pasmanda Muslims. The representation of the Pasmanda Muslims in these organizations and official bodies is quite negligible. Interestingly, at the end of his Masawat Ki Jang, Ali Anwar Ansari provides an entire list of the caste identity of those Muslims occupying positions of influence in civil society organizations and public bodies, state bodies as well. So according to the data, most of these people are from the upper caste, the elite sections of the community, thus underlying the lack of representation of Pasmanda Muslims in in mainstream society in general. This aspect was reiterated to me across my interviews with the AIPMM members. The fact that whenever there's a talk about the Muslim community in the mainstream, it almost always homogenizes the community. It is also important to note that the AIPMM's mobilization in the late 20th century could trace its political and intellectual roots most prominently to the Jamiatul Momineen or the Moment Conference, which started in 1911, Calcutta, by Maulana Asim Bihari.
Interrupt. Salva, you have 5 more minutes.
Sure. Thank you. The AIPMM socio-political ideas regarding religion and caste therefore draw their origins from the notable movement which started during the colonial period. Historians have noted that the increase in the political consciousness of the Julaha or the weaver caste came out because of the ruinous economic policies of the British Raj towards these groups. The exploitative policies of the British rule were just a second, please. Sorry about that. Ruinous economic policies of the British Raj towards these groups. The exploitative policies of the British rule were directed mostly at the artisans and weavers of the community of the country. Seeing a loss of prestige and status during this era, the Julaha community adopted the word movement, which signified piety and uprightness. So there was a claim by these weaver and artisan groups of the country of the community to adopt the term movement to elevate their status in terms of piety and uprightness. And it was these the weaver community, and the artisan groups which were very active in the nationalist movement as well during the colonial era. And the Movement Community Conference aligned itself with the Indian National Conference and against the Muslim League of those times. Scholars have noted that the political preference of the Movement Conference came from its caste and class preferences. The Movement Conference was regularly at loggerheads with the Muslim League and rejected the two-nation theory that it advocated. It rejected the Muslim League because of its caste or class composition. Further, it argued that the Movement community was a distinct group with its own identity within the Muslim community, and therefore its interests were different. One of the most notable leaders from within the Movement Conference was Abdul Qayyum Ansari, who became an active member of the Indian National Congress. So, in this case, the economic ruin of the Julahas or the weavers and the artisanal group gave a significant impetus to the mobilization of the Movement Conference. It also set the wheels of the post-colonial Pasmanda movement in general as well. In contemporary India, the Movement Ansar community is categorized as an other backward classes community for state affirmative action, and the Ansaris are the ones who have produced the most number of leaders within the Pasmanda movement in general. As briefly mentioned before, the implementation of the Mandal Commission recommendations in 1992 and the agitation that preceded it were crucial in the formation of the AIPMM several years later, along with other OBC Dalit activist groups from within the Muslim community. The impact of the Mandal Commission recommendations for the formation of the AIPMM was underlined by several interlocutors of mine. One of the chief tasks of the Mandal Commission was to identify certain socially and educationally backward classes who could be seen as targets for affirmative action. Scholars have noted that the Mandal Commission's formation and implementation was surrounded by a change in the language surrounding affirmative action. So during my fieldwork, I found out that the political tumult that followed the creation and implementation of the Mandal Commission was significant in the formation of the Pasmanda Muslim consciousness. Many of my interlocutors said that by including Dalit and intermediate Muslims within the OBC category, a significant fillip was received by the Pasmanda Muslim movement in general. It allowed for the creation and advancement of Pasmanda Muslim leadership, which relied heavily on OBC groups from within the Muslim community. So during my fieldwork, I noticed the predominance of the Ansari or weaver community within the AIPMM. The Ansaris within the Muslim community are one of the other backward classes groups within the community. Most of my interlocutors from the AIPMM were Ansaris themselves and had been quite prominent within its working. Therefore, out of the AIPMM, what happened was that there was a growth of largely OBC, in this case Ansari leadership, who became quite visible. A significant reason behind Ansari visibility could also be the long history of the movement that spanned across the 20th century. When I raised this question of Ansari predominance within the AIPMM, all my interlocutors said that one of the reasons behind this was the sheer numerical strength of the Ansari caste group within the Muslim community. Apart from the above, there was one more aspect of the AIPMM civic activism which I interrogated during my field, the impact that it had on the political sphere. From the data that I gathered, I understood that the AIPMM's tangible impact was extremely local and most visible in the state where it had been born, Bihar. The AIPMM interlocutors told me that the support and mobilization of Pasmanda Muslims was crucial to the win of Janata Dal United Party's government in 2005. And one of the issues of the Pasmanda Awaz even said that the Muslim Yadav combination, which had been the backbone of the Lalu Prasad Yadav support base, did not include Pasmanda Muslims at all. So the journal issue even said that it was because Pasmanda Muslims refused to extend their support to the Rashtriya Janata Dal, it was unable to form a government. So, and another impact was felt in a very local and regional way, through which the Pasmanda Muslims, various activists were appointed in official bodies such as panchayats and nagar nikayas. And one Dalit Muslim founding member of the AIPMM was also made a member of the Backward Classes Commission in Bihar. So we see that the critical and creative ideas of the AIPMM problematize the dominant understanding of caste and religion in post-colonial India. At one hand, it talks about how the state needs to recognize the existence of scheduled caste groups from within the Muslim community, and on the other hand, it criticizes the idea of a religiously defined minority. In doing this, it questions the dominant way in which the state and civil society see the categories of religion and caste. The AIPMM criticizes the way in which religious minorities have been configured in post-colonial India. And Therefore, it made interesting discursive and intellectual interventions in the way in which these categories have been understood officially, and in its articulations, it marked an interesting shift within lower caste politics as well as Muslim politics as it had been seen in post-colonial India. We see the extremely local impact that the EIPMM has had on the larger political sphere. However, given the post-colonial state's understanding and framing of religious and caste-based groups, its articulations and interventions have been quite limited. It can also be said that given the overall marginalization and backwardness of the Muslim community, the EIPMM's ideas remain on the margin. Thank you.
Thank you, Salwa. I keep getting mails from Professor Guru that he's been trying to get in. I can't see him in the people list here. Can anybody see him? Is Professor Guru a part of the meeting? If he isn't, then of course I don't know all the names, and if he's a part of the people who've joined, a part of the attendees, then he's free to sort of unmute himself. He keeps mailing me that he's facing technical difficulties and he's trying to join. Anyway, I don't know whether he has joined, and I've received 2 mails from him. I've advised him on the technical process. So what we'll do is we will go ahead with Dr. Jha as the acting chair, because I clearly can't see him on the people list. So Dr. Jha will be the acting chair. The process will be that she's free to decide on whether to begin with her comments and then open it up for Q&A or break it into 2 phases. So please keep your questions with you for now, because it will first be the comments from the discussant and then we'll open it up for questions. So Dr. Jha, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Rohit. Am I audible? Am I?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so I would like to congratulate the organizers for, putting this diligence of bringing these 4 papers, and also in terms of the larger conversation that I feel that all the 4 papers are. And I have identified 4 major common threads of these presentations. And I think something which is very interesting is with regard to the larger global intellectual history of ideas. And I feel that all these 4 papers are making these very important fracture lines in the way we do history of ideas, or the way we've been looking at how intellectual history is done. I think one of the first conjecture that I found in all the 4 papers, 4 very brilliant, fascinating papers, is with regard to the identity, the religious idiom, not so much in Kelvin's paper, because it is coming from a different standard, it's coming from a different vantage point, but in terms of how marginal subjectivities were engaging with distinct forms of religious sort of congregation or community. So I think that that's brilliant. These are narratives of resistance, and in these narratives of resistance, you find invocation of religion and culture. I mean, if I want to involve Kelvin's paper, so I find cultural and religious idioms centrally placed in these stories of subversion, of dignified selfhood, and of the notion of self-worth, which is very central to, I mean, Ambedkar's project. But what is rather fascinating is how each of these communities that we're talking about are subverting the mainstream. So there's an element of dissent, and there's a very interesting framework for us to renegotiate the manner in which we look at politics of mainstream religion. Then the other major aspect from the perspective of intellectual history is the shift beyond the canons, the shift beyond the text. Because if you want to look at the exchanges, if you want to look at the community formation, or if you want to look at collectives, it is moving beyond the canons, which I think is very fundamental with the larger aim of what we are doing here as part of this workshop. So I would like to congratulate you for that. And also, like, in terms of positionality, in each of these papers, one of the central arguments that global intellectual history has been posing is how do we position geography, how do we position space, how do we position something like positionality. So the element of positionality makes it a very legitimate framework of renegotiating global intellectual history. And the last element which I thought was common in terms of these narratives is in terms of a shift, in terms of a major kind of question, which I think we need to start posing from a post-colonial perspective, that, these claims of global intellectual history, how global are they truly? If we want to find the narratives, even from the Indian intellectual history or something like Indian political thought, I think one of the major successes of all the 4 papers is bringing the stories from the margins which have never been brought, like in terms of the understanding that we have. Is a very centrist understanding. We are still engaging with all these great men and leaders, but all these 4 narratives are bringing margins at the center. And in terms of reimagining the center, reimagining the margin. So I think all the 4 paper really successfully does that. But I have 3 common questions for these paper. I will pose those questions and then I would go to each paper specifically. First, what does these projects mean in the larger global intellectual history of ideas kind of perspective? Secondly, if one is to pose Indian intellectual traditions in thinking, how would we deploy these narratives as bringing contestations and fracture lines within Indian intellectual history? Or in terms of Indian intellectual history, bringing these fracture lines in the global intellectual history ideas framework. Some of these works which have been celebrated as being authoritative in terms of setting the discourse on global intellectual history, Sartori and Sam Mohan's work. But one major text, I think, which makes a lot of sense for our kind of project is C. Stuman's Invention of Humanity, because he is really making global intellectual history of ideas democratic with that work. So in terms of that, because the trouble is that despite the claims of intellectual history working towards the pursuit of being global intellectual history, it still suffers from the problems of being Eurocentric and transatlantic in the framework. And I think this is something that we need to really start thinking very seriously, because many a times our interlocutors are still coming from the West, are still coming from Western thinking. So it would be interesting, I would be interested in knowing your thoughts that if one has to bring an interlocutor from the post-colonial kind of world, in which I'm bringing Latin America, in which I'm bringing Asia, and I'm bringing Africa, would it be interesting if our interlocutors were from this part of the world? Our thinkers, our actors, our collectives in conversation with this part of the intellectual world. And also in terms of the blind spots, because I'm thinking about gendered intellectual history of ideas, and this argument that some of us have been making that global intellectual history of ideas is still very limited to the world of the male thinking, male gaze, invisibilizing women thinkers, and also like in terms of subsuming the responses of women in these collectives. And in Dwaipayan's paper, he brings out very beautifully as to how the Namasudra women were also part of these exchanges and these questions. But in terms of the other paper, I felt that was a blind spot in terms of assuming that the subaltern, the Dravidian subaltern internationalism, I would be interested in knowing how were women responding to these collectives, or for that matter, AIPMM, like how were women responding to the larger concerns and questions, and also in terms of politicizing. It might sound as a cliche kind of position, but it's a very central position, because through your work, you are looking at a major blind spot in global intellectual history, or for that matter, in the Indian intellectual history. But my question is that in terms of our narrative, how successful are we to are we speaking on behalf of women? Are these dignified selfhood similar for women in these communities? So these are my general common questions for all the paper. Now coming to each of the paper, I would be very brief because we are short on time and we need to take questions. I mean, I had really written down what were the interesting parts of the paper. I think all the 4 papers are very, very fascinating, starting with Kelvin. You know, Kelvin, you are reiterating a very important argument about the migratory nature of ideas and how ideas were traveling and how ideas were shaping these identities and acts of subversion. So I think that's a very important sort of contribution to the way we do history of ideas, and also in terms of spaces, whether they're ideational or material. My questions are basically the more curiosity that when Periyar, and I really like the fact that you are not homogenizing the experiences into common. You've been very successful in terms of bringing the divergence in terms of how the reception to Periyar were, or how were they engaging with these ideas, despite the common that these two actors and their newspapers have. But I'm interested in knowing, when Periyar came back to India, did he speak about the migrant Tamils? Because 1896, when Gandhi comes to India, you know, you're mentioning how Gandhi, the role of Gandhi in terms of the Satyagraha in South Africa and shaping that notion of subversion. But when Gandhi comes back, he writes this text called the Green Pamphlet, in which he is basically introducing the Indian audience to the problems of the indentured laborers in South Africa. So I'm interested in knowing, how was this happening with regard to the Dravidian movement? Was Periyar also using India was using these issues for his activism in India in terms of laying a larger transnational kind of Dravidian subaltern identity? And also the role of these emigre intellectuals, you know, both of them. I mean, post-independence, how much role did they play in terms of the Dravidian politics in India? Because these ideas are moving. So these are two very important frameworks for us to know the larger reception of these ideas, both in Malay and both in India and in Malay. So I think these are my 2 questions for you, and also I would like to reiterate the gender question. Now, coming to Dr. Sen's paper, very interesting, the exchange that you bring to us many a times, you know, problematizing the way historical narrative has been in terms of the responses to the whole question of conversion or the role of missionaries. So you're bringing a very interesting perspective to that, and it's very very important to know these divergences, these differences, because then it makes our understanding of those times much better. I have 2 questions for you. One is with regard to what were the responses of the nationalist actors, you know, because this was happening around the Swadeshi movement, as you mentioned so brilliantly in your paper. So what were the responses to these exchanges between the Namasudras and the Baptists in terms of the larger social milieu of Bengal? And also, like, the nationalist kind of leadership, how were they, like, if you want to take the Vipin Chandra kind of framework, how are they responding to these exchanges? And also, you know, you do mention about the intentionality of the missionaries, and you do bring out the element of frustration when not a lot of Namashudras converted into Christianity. But I am really curious to know how would you read the intentionality? Was it simply about this good heart and this humanity, this Christian idiom of reaching out to those who are lesser privileged than you, or would you be also curious to see if there's some kind of political sort of foundation to these conversions, you know? And you've mentioned mentioned it, you know, your paper is the only paper which brings out the gendered aspect of these exchanges, and you're mentioning the meeting that happens at Guru Chandra Thakur's home, and all these big movements, transformation in the form of child marriage, widow marriage. I want to know how much of women participation was that, and how were women receiving these exchanges? So those are my 2 questions for your paper. Mukund, very interesting paper. You really brought out a very interesting trajectory, starting with Ambedkar's conversion. What does it mean in terms of reading it as a text? And also in terms of Bodhanand's role in UP. Because this is a very familiar work, I have a couple of questions for you. I would want you to elaborate on the non-canonical archival territories that you're mentioning. So it would be interesting for me, for your reader to know, to have a line or two, to know how are you invoking these non-canonical. Are you looking at the life? Are you looking at organization? Are you looking at practices? What do you mean by these non-canonical sources, territories, non-canonical archival territories? And you use Bodhanand as somebody who's central to your vulgar history. And you kind of start that after Ambedkar. But if I want to take your rationality, if I want to take your explanation of how you are invoking vulgar history, I think Ambedkar is also part of that vulgar history. He's very much part of the everydayness. He's very much part of the organic politics. To say that his ideas are, of course, we've been successful in terms of archiving his work, but if you're using that as a criteria to delineate between a vulgar history and positioning Bodhanand's life and contribution in that sense, I think I would be very curious to know if you would want to see Ambedkar also in that framework. Because if you are invoking Ambedkar in the margins, in the everydayness, in the common parlance of the people, in the common resistances, I think we would have a very different interpretation of how we invoke Ambedkar as a central figure of on position of human condition. And also, like, you position Ambedkar as a central figure in terms of Buddhism in the anti-caste resistances. There's a larger genealogy in which you can position Ambedkar, something that I've been working with. So Ambedkar's conversion, 1956, is a big moment, but there's a history of 200 years, which is preceded by people like Dharmapala, that you've mentioned it, but it's the same Anagarika Dharmapala, the Buddhist revival, who sets up Mahabodhi society that plays a very important role in terms of revival of Buddhism, and also like giving a very strong critique of the delineation of Buddhism from the Hindu fold. And then you have Rahul Sampradaya from the same region. And Rahul Sampraday's trajectory is rather very fascinating. Starts off as a Arya Samaji, becomes a Marxian, and towards the end of his life, he's a Buddhist monk. And the kind of role that he played in the local struggles, especially during the national movement on the farmers' agitation. So, you've taken Bodhananda, but it would be interesting to know if Bodhanand, because of the same region, if they were ever in communication, because Sampradaya is trying to bring in the Buddhist Marxian dialectics on the human condition, especially on the agrarian question. And Bodhananda is trying to do that in the way you describe him. So that, and also like in terms of the present day, like how much available is Bodhananda in the present day caste sort of resistances? Because the contemporary is so important. And I will quickly come to Salva's paper, very interesting paper, Salva, in which you're bringing this narrative of the Muslim community, congregation, why people came together, the larger demands, and its larger sort of present in the Bihar politics in the contemporary times. I just have two questions. Because you mentioned you're tracing the ideological framework back to the Moment Conference. But post-independence, I feel there's a disconnect, and you come to 1992 and then you come to this time. So there's a huge time lag. So what was happening in this time? I can understand that, the paper had to be written with certain word limits. So I would be curious about that. Presence of other organizations. Are there other Muslim collectives apart from AIPMM? And also its presence in other parts of the country beyond Bihar? And in terms of the present elections that happened, what is the entanglement that the present government, JDU government, Nitish's government, along with AIPMM, AIPMM. So these are my questions, and I would request everyone, whoever has a question, kindly put your question in the chat box. And because of paucity of time, I would request you to be brief, and we can, I mean, Rohit, we can have this session till 4:15, if that's all right. It's already 3:57 Indian Standard Time.
Yeah,
Can we
next
go to
panel is from
4:15?
4:30, so 4:15, 4:20.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
4:15, 4:20 should be fine.
So we will take a couple of questions, and in the meanwhile, I would request the presenters to kindly answer or respond. And Professor Guru is here.
Yes, hi everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you,
Okay.
Professor Guru. You missed out on the
Okay,
better
okay.
part of the workshop, so we'll just introduce
Yes,
you
yes.
and then you can come in with your comments.
Yes.
You can hear us fine, right? I'll just briefly introduce you. In fact, we did introduce you in absentia, but
Give me 1 minute.
I'll,
Give me 1 minute. I'll just use my headphone.
okay. So instead of putting in a message, now that we have Professor Guru, we might extend this till for. I'm guessing Dr. Jha and everyone else is listening. We can extend this to 4:25. I think that should be fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So we have Professor Guru with us. Professor Guru, you missed the better part of the workshop, but you have read everyone's abstracts and you have a brief idea of what they presented on. So I'll just introduce in a line, and then if you want to comment, Dr. Jha, if it's okay with you, if the Professor Guru comments, and then we can open it up for them. So Professor Guru needs no introduction. He's an Indian political scientist. He's the editor of the journal EPW. He's a retired professor in political science from the Center for Political Studies, JNU. He was also visiting professor at Columbia, Oxford, and Pennsylvania. I'll leave it at that. So I'll ask Professor Guru to comment with a few points based on what he has already read about the papers. Professor Guru, if you want to come in. Unfortunately, you missed the presentations, but if you want to come in.
What does it mean I missed the presentation? They have presented already or what?
Yes,
Hello?
Can you hear me fine?
Yes, yes, you go ahead. So
yeah, so they
are
had
not
presented.
They are not present. Sorry, go ahead, go ahead. There will be no confusion.
They have actually presented, because I think there must have been some miscommunication. The panel was from 2 p.m. IST, so they have actually presented their papers, but we have just begun the discussions. So you are aware of what their papers entailed.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So your mail says that it is from 4 o'clock IST. So I was ready from 4 o'clock. Can you hear me? I am
Yes, sir, we
speaking.
can hear you.
Yeah. So your Rohit's mail says the proceedings will start at 4 o'clock IST. So I just thought now I will listen to the presentations, and then we will have a discussion starting with Priyanka. So that was the idea, I thought. So now that doesn't matter since everyone knows them. So I will ask Priyanka to go ahead and make her comments.
I think there must have been some 5 minutes. With your comments.
Yeah, Priyanka, are you ready?
Yes, sir. I have just finished my comments. So if you give the permission, we can ask the presenters to respond to the comments and then take question and answers.
Yeah, I think I have missed everything, Rohit. I just missed everything. So I think I will just participate in the discussion. That's it. Let the presenters.
And if you don't mind, and Professor Guru, if you don't mind, maybe because I don't want the presenters to miss out on your comments, maybe we can send their full papers to you, and you can later give them
Yes,
comments.
yes, yeah, that is one possibility. But at the moment, let's listen to Priyanka and the paper readers. So I'll just listen to them, and then I'll
Okay.
speak.
Okay, thank you, Professor Guru. So will the paper presenters respond to the discussants' comments?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to the comments. Thank you so much, Professor Cha, for your very insightful and incisive comments. I think that you're right in identifying the stakes of all of the project of global intellectual history, and I think that a central sort of intervention that I see across all four papers is a staging of perhaps
Sorry, may I interrupt? Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi. Yeah, sorry. My name is Kelvin, and I was a presenter in this panel. I'm
Okay.
currently a PhD student at Yale University in
Okay,
history.
okay. I have your details. Okay, go ahead.
And I think that it's really a sort of reintroduction of the question of positionality to the field of global intellectual history, and perhaps a sort of challenging of the precepts of global intellectual history by asking who gets to sort of become recognized as an intellectual, as a speaking intellectual, right? And to sort of disrupt or challenge the sort of distinction between intellectual labor and manual labor that someone like Gramsci has identified, to think about the conditions of intellectual organicity that in a more Gramscian vein. And in that regard, I think that Professor Guru's own work on sort of thinking about this sort of divide between the theoretical Brahmin and the empirical Shudra that has structured much of how political thought has been, the history of political thought has been conceived, has been incredibly influential on my own thinking and my own work as well. And to respond more specifically to the questions that you posed, first on Berryar's return to India. So I didn't fully elaborate on this in this paper, partly because I wanted to perhaps shift the focus away a bit from the sort of big man biography of Berryar. But in the Kudi Arasi, he did write extensively about Tamil labor migration to Malaya, and that became a sort of structuring condition for his own critique of caste, where he argues that it's precisely the conditions of caste degradation that he witnessed in the Tamil country that motivated laborers to migrate abroad in search for other economic opportunities, even though his own observations in Malaya comported with the fact that caste strictures were not fully challenged at all. But in the Kudi Arasu, I would say that the role of this sort of like emigre internationalism on Berryar's own thought came in two ways. Firstly, ideational, that is structured the conditions of possibility for his own thinking about caste and caste reform. But on the other hand, on a more material level, the Kudi Arasu received funding from many Tamil laborers who are working in Malaya, in Ceylon, and in Burma. And they received many letters, correspondences from writers who are writing in from these places as well. So I think that this ties really nicely into the question of gender as well, because this is really where I got to sort of get more of a view of like women's voices in this process of creating a sort of Dravidian subaltern internationalism. One of the more fascinating sort of archival findings that I had was a series of letters by a woman identified as Pinang Janaki, who was writing about a range of topics ranging from self-respect marriages and closer to the 1940s about the possibility of war in British Malaya and what the role of the Tamil laborers in Malaya should be, where their loyalty should lie. Should they, cooperate with like the Indian National Army, or should they oppose the Japanese and the British together? So really, it's like it's really in the sort of like readers' correspondences and readers' letters in the Kudi Arasu that you really get a sense of women's voices. But at the same time, gender was itself important to the project of self-respect in Malaya, where self-respect marriages became a key demand and a key sort of project for many of these self-respecters. So G. Sarangapani, the central figure that I was looking at, he himself married a Chinese woman in 1937, and throughout all these, throughout both the Munetram and the Tamil Muras, self-respect marriages were really widely publicized, and the sort of natural comparison that they were making actually was to Chinese reform marriages that were being undertaken by Chinese laborers influenced by the May 4th movement. So I think that's another sort of like that's another sort of objective of my paper, to sort of stage this as a global intellectual history in the most global sense, where the coordinates for intellectual reform and intellectual movements do not merely come from the immediacy of like their cultural context, or the immediacy of a sort of borrowing from the West sort of framework that I think some of Moyne and Sartori's would remain quite beholden to, but rather it's really multifarious in the way that many of them are absorbing influences from concurrent social movements in other parts of Asia and in other parts of what we might today know as the Third World or the Global South. But thank you so much for your comments, and I look forward to any other questions that others might have.
Thank you, Kelvin. As you can see in the chat box, there's one question for Dr. Sen and one question for Salva. There's another question for Salva. So maybe it would be nice that with your responses, if you can respond to these questions in the chat box. So Dr. Sen, can we have your response to the larger comments? And if you want, I can read the question which is there for you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jha, for your wonderful commentary. I really enjoyed all the papers as well. I with the paucity of time in mind, I'll try and be relatively brief. This question that you opened with about what these projects mean for global intellectual history. Yes, I mean, certainly I'd second what has already been said before in terms of turning to a more genuine global intellectual history. That said, certainly, Andrew Sartori's and Samuel Moyne's work has been, very generative, even though people have become critical of it. The work that I draw a great deal of inspiration from is Andrew Sartori's Liberalism in Empire, where he's actually struggling with, the very problem that he and Sam kind of described. So I mean, and the references in the draft that I circulated bear that out. Let me just turn to the more specific questions that you posed to me. What were the responses to the exchanges between Namasudras and Baptists on the part of the nationalists? As I kind of suggest in the paper, they're tremendously uncomfortable about it. And in fact, there's a kind of reactionary move on the part of the upper castes of the region once they see these conversations developing between Namasudras and Baptists. And in fact, this whole idea of uplift, I would say, is actually a product of relationships between European missionaries and various Dalit groups. I would expand this observation to the entirety of the country. Certainly, I think it obtains in Bengal and in Eastern India. But the point being that the notion, the Gandhian notion of uplift is a reactionary response to what is going on for decades, if not centuries. So that's the broader point I'd like to make. This question about how to read Baptist intentionality, it's a very complex one. There's the obvious response is that the intention is to quite simply expand the flock, right? To proselytize and to proselytize successfully. I think what's very interesting about the case that I've examined is that unlike other parts of the country, here proselytization is not particularly successful. But nonetheless, there's such a deep investment on the part of Namasudras in the Baptists. So that kind of disjuncture is something that I find quite fascinating, and also because again, Bengal is in kind of collective consciousness is not particularly associated with mass conversion movements, which one sees more in the South, in the West, and so on and so forth. This question of women's participation, I think it's extensive. I think it's absolutely extensive, and there are kind of suggestions. I mean, of the kind that I kind of described in the paper, but in terms of kind of individual speech acts that Namasudra women may have articulated, in the sources that I looked at, I didn't find quite so many. I'll have to I'll have to kind of go through the documents again with your question in mind. So thank you very much. I just, with the time I have remaining, I just want to pose a question to Kelvin. I found this concept of subaltern internationalisms utterly fascinating and very generative. Um, my question was really, what, I mean, in the material you've been working with, did you find evidence of connections to other regions of the Tamil diaspora, right? Because, I mean, here you're really doing a Tamil Nadu and Malay kind of set of dynamics. As I'm sure you know, I mean, the Tamil diaspora is essentially, for all intents and purposes, global by the late 19th, early 20th. So that was really something I was curious about. Because again, if you're talking about internationalisms, right, how might we kind of most effectively kind of ground that concept?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sen. You have two questions from the audience. Maybe we will come to Mukund for his response. And in the meanwhile, we can close the discussion with your responses to the two questions.
Okay.
And we can take Kelvin's response after Salva finishes with her responses. Is that fine, Kelvin? Wonderful. So Mukund, I would now request you to kindly respond to the...
Yeah, thank you, Professor Jha, for those astute comments.
Sorry, please be very brief because we are already 4:15.
Yeah. I'll be very short. I'll be very precise. I'll try to also merge a few of the things that you have said. And when it comes to non-canonical archival territory and the question of Bodhanand in contemporary, kind of would like to merge it together, saying that it's a life that was lived out in the common. It was a response to the common. And therefore, the archive is not an institutional archive anymore. It's the archive of the common. So, for example, texts such as Bodhacharya Paddhati, although it has run into 11 or 12 reprints, and after Ambedkar's conversion in 1956, there was a reprint in Marathi edition as well. So it gets translated into Marathi, and then there are multiple Marathi reprints of the same text. But it's a text which is not institutional. It's a text to be kept in the houses. It's text to be followed. And therefore, it's a life, an archival territory, which is not located in institutions anymore. So it's a text for the common, a response for the common. So I'll just pause here with the response of this question, of these two questions. The vulgar in Ambedkar is a very complex idea. It's quite interesting and quite complex. I'll just be again very precise. We in our readings, we have as of now focused on the Eurocentric part of Ambedkar. If we read multiple readings, Gale, right from let's say Eliot to even the recent books such as Radical in Ambedkar, which has plethora of essays on Ambedkar. The Eurocentric is something which is, the central part, which is continuously picked up. Aishwarya Kumar, when reading Maitri, would again pick up on force and adoration, borrowing Nietzsche in Ambedkar and doing all that. But as much as Ambedkar is DV, as much as Ambedkar is Eurocentric, Ambedkar is vulgar in some ways. And that's a complex kind of reading of Ambedkar, which might be possible because Ambedkar before convert, and this is a large chunk of history from 36 declaration to 1956 conversion. It's an almost an absent history. What did Ambedkar do? Where all did Ambedkar go? Whom all did Ambedkar visit? And in this meantime, Ambedkar visits Bodhanand twice. He has 2 meetings with Bodhanand in Lucknow, and they discuss Buddhism together. So as much as Ambedkar is about DV, reading Quest for Justice like books, just before writing Buddha and his Dhamma, he's also reading and talking to Bodhanand. He's also talking and reading to other Buddhists. And the question of the larger genealogy and networks, I'll just be very precise here. It's true that there is a 200 years of genealogy behind all these texts, which starts from Olcott, actually. It starts from Olcott in Sri Lanka, and Gombrich and Ganana Tobasekara have done fascinating works to point that out. But it's also a network which is outside that, outside the Mahabodhi circuit. And when it comes to Rahul, someone like Rahul Sanskritan, who is in many networks, he will write a text, Sanskritan writes a text, Jinka mein kritagya hoon, and he claims that Bodhanand is the one in that text to introduce him to Buddhism. So what is the life of these intellectuals when they are not part of one network, but these multiple networks getting sanctions from multiple tropes and implotments about Buddhism? Just last point on gender and post-colonial interlocutors. I think that's a very valid argument. It's a very valid argument, and people like Cantwell Smith, Talal Asad, Sabah Mahmood, when they try to do their work and when they try to read, someone like Talal Asad would read Abu in Egypt for looking at his reworkings of religion. Can we have a reading like Abu in our, when we are talking about anti-caste Buddhist resistances, is something that I kind of borrow. The gender blind spot in the case is quite fascinating, and I completely agree with you.
Again, because we have seven more minutes, and Salva has to respond, and we.
Yeah, and I'll just pause by saying that it's something that it's there, but the ways in which it exists and the ways in which it doesn't exist does require me to relook into the archival territory. I'll just stop there. I did have something for Professor Dwaipayan saying, but maybe later if I have time, or maybe I'll just write it in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions. Regarding Dr. Jha's broad questions, I would say that where my paper really fits into this whole intellectual history, the debate around intellectual history, and where does this fit into the global intellectual history. I would say that it tries to point out that ideas always emerge in reference to the political history of a country, and also in reference to the way the state configures religious groupings and different ethnic groupings. So I would say that when we study the history of ideas, we need to take into account the material situations of particular communities, and also the way, as I said, the state is configuring and trying to organize religious groupings and other ethnic groupings. So I think that is one thing that we need to take into account. The question of gender, yes, when I was doing my fieldwork, the only female interlocutor that I spoke to said that caste is the most overarching, for Pasmanda Muslims, caste is the most overarching category, and gender just gets subsumed under it. Therefore, caste informs every other experience of Pasmanda Muslims. So gender comes secondary, which according to me is slightly problematic, because it tends to essentialize the whole notion of caste and even gender. So I would say that so this ontological privileging of one category, say caste, over other vectors of suppression or hierarchy is a little problematic. So yeah, that is a blind spot of the Pasmanda movement in general, to say that caste is the most important category. Regarding your specific questions to me, there is a gap in my paper, but as I spoke in my presentation, that there were other low caste groups which emerged from within the Muslim community, like say Shabir Ansari's organization in Maharashtra and Ijaz Ali's organization in Bihar. so there were other organization, lower caste and Dalit activist groups which emerged in Bihar, and after independence, the movement conference got subsumed within the Indian National Congress, which was, as we say, as we know, an umbrella organization, an umbrella party, which subsumed various interests within itself. So the way it got subsumed after independence was quite instrumental in its decline in the post-colonial era. But and similarly in the current scenario, you were speaking about Nitish Kumar's government. Again, the a lot of critics of the Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz have said that by being involved in party politics in Nitish Kumar's party or Lalu Prasad Yadav's party, there has been a subsuming of the Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz's agenda in general. So there has been so whenever civic engagement gets involved in party politics, there is a kind of a decline, as we can see in the Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz's case. And regarding the question that I received in the chat, yeah. So, what is Meena's question about how the Pasmanda community has been impacted by BJP's assemblance at the center? I would say that that Narendra Modi a few years ago had tried to make a speech in an outreach towards the Pasmanda Muslims, saying that Pasmanda Muslims are not getting their due within the Muslim community. Very similar to how the BJP has tried to make outreaches towards the Muslim women, especially in cases of triple talaq. But I would say that the way Pasmanda movement sees caste and religious identities in politics, I would say it undercuts BJP's attempts of polarization, of religious polarization, and trying to organize society according to religious groupings. So the Pasmanda movement's articulations actually undercut BJP's religious mobilization. And Razak's question about the religious and the secular making one the category of minority. Yes, I would say that the AIPMM's understanding of minority does not take into, as I said in the paper, that it does not take religion into account, but rather takes caste into account and says that instead of looking at religion, one should look at the way socioeconomic, similarly placed socioeconomic castes have should come together, and they should try to articulate their own position. Instead of doing a Hindu or Muslim antagonism, and there's an Islamic discourse of movement, but then also yes. So as I said in my paper, that even though there was an attempt by the movement conference to adopt the term movement to emphasize on their piety as compared to other Muslims, but in the current scenario, in the current scenario of affirmative action, the term movement is largely a target group for affirmative action by the state. So there has been a very interesting shift in the term or the idea of who is a woman as well. So yeah, thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you, Salva. It is 4:25. I am afraid the next session is at 4:30. So on strict instructions of the organizer, I am afraid we will have to close the session until unless Dr. Sen and Kelvin would take 1 minute to respond to their questions. Or would you want to do that later, like through mail or something?
I can just very briefly go through the questions on the chat function. Mustaqim, there's a whole controversy about the upper caste quote unquote origins of the Namasudra community. So I'll just say there are a variety of views on this matter. Let's see who's next. Rohit's question. Yeah, I was thinking specifically about the comparison with the context that Rupa Vishwanath is talking about, and there I think there are similarities, right? Despite the overall differences that I'm alluding to, there are similarities insofar as one might make the somewhat controversial claim that caste in essence is about political economy, right? That it's about a kind of twofold division of laborers, that one can see in some ways throughout the country. Anyway, I could speak endlessly about that matter, but and then finally, Rajot Rai's question, while you talked about vernacular liberalism. Yeah, I mean, I think the point that I'm making about Namasudra vernacular liberalism is that it only strengthens with time over the course of the early to mid 20th century. And in my kind of understanding, there are, these three major domains that come to be emphasized not only in Bengal but elsewhere in India. That one being political representation, the other being access to education, and the third being demands for agrarian reform. And I think one can trace each of these concerns to the moment that I'm talking about. Sorry, I'll end there.
Thank you. Kelvin has very kindly agreed to respond through mail. We have Professor Guru. If Professor Guru would like to say, would share his thoughts or comments. Okay.
Professor Guru, would you like to come in and make a few comments before we wind up? Sorry, he might be experiencing technical difficulties, but we are out of time.
Yes.
So we'll just wind up this panel here. We'll just wind up this panel here, and hopefully the technical problems did not dishearten you or did not wean you away from attending the remaining panels. So do join us. Thank you to the speakers and to Dr. Jha. Thank you. Hope to see you in the next panels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.